Welcome everyone to this Hoover Institution Library and Archives Curator Conversation. And this is about the behind the scenes of our latest exhibition located in the Lou Henry Hoover Gallery in Hoover Tower here on the Stanford University campus called Eastern Europe and Beyond, Photographic Albums Revealed. Before we kick things off, allow me to first introduce myself. My name is Lauren Cavetta, and I'm the Strategic Communications Manager for the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. And I'd like to also welcome you more generally. If this is the first time you've joined one of our events online or in person, we're really thrilled that you're able to make it, in particular after a holiday weekend. So we very much appreciate your presence and attention for this next hour. As always, I want to make sure we thank some very important people, including certainly our director of the Hoover Institution, Dr. Condoleezza Rice, for her support, really unwavering of our work here at the Library and Archives, and her shared passion for some of our collections, including those from the region we'll be talking about today. Our overseers or our board of directors, there may be some of our supporters online with us, and we want to extend really our warmest thanks and gratitude. Without you, we could not display these wonderful materials, preserve and protect them for generations to come. And lastly, I want to make sure that I thank all those who contributed to this exhibition. It is really a village here in the Library and Archives between our curators, who you'll hear from today, our preservation department, our engagement team, who help really display and bring these exhibitions to life, and of course our events and planning colleagues who help us roll out the promotion for all the wonderful work that we can share with our external audiences. Now, this exhibition really serves as a reminder that while the Hoover Institution began first and foremost as a library in 1919, Herbert Hoover, our founder, really emphasized collecting these unpublished sources or things we would kind of classify as archival materials relating to war, revolution, and peace. And when we say materials, that could include diaries, letters, manuscripts of individuals, both famous and also obscure. Those happen to be some of the favorites among our staff. But this is really at the core of what we do and have continued to do for over 100 years. We consider ourselves very much ahead of our time, and both here in the Library and Archives and in our research and policy think tank, continuing to advance freedom and the ideas that support it. Now, as far as this conversation today goes, allow me to introduce our three speakers or curators among the few that we did have for this exhibition in particular, called Eastern Europe and Beyond, Photographic Albums Revealed. Anatol Shmelev is a research fellow and the Robert Conquest Curator for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia collections. Today, he'll reflect on the context of the albums displayed in this exhibition, dealing really with the Russian Civil War and early immigration, and particularly as it's displayed in the Gajda album featured in the exhibition on view. Ognin Kovacevic, he is our metadata librarian, and he'll speak today on his contributions, which focused on albums and photographs depicting the Balkan Peninsula, and more specifically, the movements of the Serbian and Montenegrin armies and civilians during the Balkan Wars and World War I. And closing us out today in our conversation will be Vladimir Von Tsurikov. He is our project leader of the Russian Diaspora Initiative. You might have heard about the Russia Abroad Digital Collection, really one of our flagship digital digitization efforts featuring émigré newspapers from around the world. Today, he'll offer remarks on the Legie Ruska under Major General Radola Gajda, and you'll have to forgive my pronunciation. And I'll also discuss the Russian émigré presence in interwar Czechoslovakia, as reflected in albums and archival papers, assembled specifically by Baroness Maria Vrangel. And so with that, I would like to turn over to our first speaker, Anatol Shmelev.
Thank you, Lauren, for that kind introduction. I'm glad to be with you today to talk a little bit about some of the albums that we have on exhibit today and up through June of this coming year. So first off, if I could start with a slide. Generally speaking, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Russian Civil War because several of these albums relate to the Russian Civil War and to, in particular, the participation of the Czechoslovak Legion in the civil war in Siberia. And the story behind this legion is quite an interesting one. It was actually several legions. They were formed on the Western Front as well as on the Eastern Front, and they consisted of Czechs and Slovaks and sometimes other nations of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, as you know, was composed of many different nationalities. And some of these had been yearning for independence for some time, even previous to the First World War. And as they were taken prisoner either on the Western Front or on the Eastern Front by the Russians, by the French, and so forth, they eventually argued for creation of a cohesive force that would be used by the Allies in order to fight for independence against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So basically, they switched sides. And so these Czechoslovak legions were formed, but they didn't get into the fight, at least on the Eastern Front, immediately. There was still some hesitation on the Russian side about using these troops. So what happened was that eventually it was really only around 1917 that the Czechoslovak Legion in Russia was actually used in battle. So, in other words, during the period of the revolution itself. And then, of course, when the Bolsheviks took power in November of 1917, at that point, the Bolsheviks began to take the country out of the First World War. And so the Czechs and Slovaks found themselves in this limbo. They weren't of any use anymore on the front. They couldn't fight for their own independence at the front. And so the idea of the Allies was at that time to move them to the Eastern Front, to the Western Front. And that required getting them out of Russia and all the way around the world to France. What this ultimately meant was that they were being transported through Siberia, and in preparation for further transportation from Vladivostok, which is in the Russian Far East, across the Pacific, and then across the North American continent over to the east, to the Western Front. And having them stuck in Siberia at a time when the Russian Civil War was breaking out really led to their involvement in that conflict against their own judgment and best interests. So what happened was that in May of 1918, there was an incident in the Siberian town of Chelyabinsk where a troop train full of Czechoslovaks was stuck at the station, and headed in the opposite direction were Hungarian prisoners of war who were being repatriated to Hungary, and a conflict developed between them. One of the Hungarians picked up a piece of metal, threw it at one of the Czech trains. It ended up killing one of the Czech soldiers, and the Czech soldiers piled out of their train and lynched the Hungarian. And then they took power in Chelyabinsk, and then all down along the Trans-Siberian Railway all the way to Vladivostok. So ultimately, they took control of the entire Trans-Siberian Railway, which gave the opportunity for anti-Bolsheviks to form an Eastern Front against the Bolsheviks in Siberia. So this album that you're looking at right now was given to one of the leaders of the Czechoslovak forces, General Radola Gajda. He actually began as a captain, as a junior officer, but he had this Napoleonic inclinations, and he was a bit of an adventurer, and so he was very soon given command as a general. If I could have the next slide, please. Here you'll see some of the photographs in the album. So this is a presentation album with descriptions of the places and events that took place under Gajda's leadership. Here you see on the right the Ipatiev house, which was actually where the Romanov family was assassinated in Yekaterinburg, and later Gajda established his headquarters at that home in Yekaterinburg, almost about a week or 10 days after the murder of the imperial family. The house no longer exists. It was torn down during the Yeltsin period, even previous to the Yeltsin period, when Yeltsin was the party secretary of the region. So this is just a fantastic album. It's a really beautiful piece that was given to Gajda by his troops later on, already in Czechoslovakia, in the independent country. Next slide, please. We have a number of other albums from the Czechoslovak Legionnaire period, and including some that were just given by officers to each other or by soldiers to their unit commanders. So they're not as ornately illustrated or as spectacular as the Gajda album is, but they're nevertheless very valuable. They depict other scenes in other areas besides the area where Gajda was active. So you get a better picture of uh, the entire experience of the Czechoslovak Legion in Siberia from 1918 all the way through to 1920. Not just Yekaterinburg, not just Chelyabinsk, but all the way out to the Far East, to Vladivostok, and to all the places in between. The Czechoslovaks were still kept in the east of Russia for a couple of years because they were guarding the railways during the Russian Civil War in the course of this Allied intervention that was taking place. And they were only transported out in 1920 back to their homeland. So we have also a number of other albums devoted to the Russian Civil War and its aftermath, in particular the Civil War in the South, where General Vrangel was also fighting the Bolsheviks up until November of 1920, after which he had to evacuate, and most of his troops the infantry went to Gallipoli, which is a peninsula in today's Turkey, and the Cossacks, mainly, of course, mounted units, went to the island of Lemnos, which is also at the coast of Turkey. It's a Greek island at the coast of Turkey. And you can see here one of the albums compiled by General Abramov, the leader of the Cossack troops on Lemnos to commemorate their period on the island. Next slide, please. You can see a little bit of their activities on the island, the tents that they lived in. As you can see, there was very little tree cover on the island, and so they suffered from all sorts of cold, bitter winds during the winter going through the camp, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience. About 150 of them died on the island as a result of a typhus epidemic and other diseases and illnesses, but the rest managed to survive, and about a year later, they were transported primarily to Yugoslavia. And so this album commemorated their short period on the island of Lemnos. You can see some of their activities, gymnastics for the younger troops, and parades and tent life. And so the album is really reflective of that experience that they had there on Lemnos. Next slide, please. Besides the army and the Cossacks on Lemnos and Gallipoli, there were also a large number of civilian refugees stuck in Constantinople, or today's Istanbul itself. And so these were aided by American relief organizations, including the American Red Cross and the YMCA. And you can see a couple of, again, commemorative presentation albums that were given by the Russian emigres to their American benefactors. So on the top left corner is an album to Alma Ruggles, who was one of the associates of Anna V.S. Mitchell, whose collection of papers we have here, and that's why the album is here, who was working for the American Red Cross. And down on the right lower corner, you can see an album that was given to Lynn Scipio, who was representing the YMCA, helping out Russian students and other youth who were evacuated to Istanbul. And you can see there the remains of the Rumeli Fortress on the banks of the Bosphorus. So it's quite a beautiful album, and really representative of the gratitude of the Russian emigres stuck in Istanbul at the end of the Russian Civil War to the Americans who helped them out of their difficult and sometimes hopeless situation. This slide I'm going to save for last, so we can discuss this during the Q&A period. Well, thank you so much for the time, and I'm going to turn over to the next presenter. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Anatol, and thank you, Lauren. So I'll be talking about the segment of the exhibit related to the Balkan Peninsula and the beautiful photographic albums at Hoover Institution Library and Archives collections, more specifically related to Serbia's involvement in the Balkan Wars and the First World War. Before starting, I would like just to provide you with context of Balkan Wars and situation in the Balkans in the second decade of the 20th century. Next slide, please. So Balkan Peninsula represents the southeastern part of Europe, and it starts from Greece in the south and goes to the rivers Sava and Danube in the north, and it's bordered with the Adriatic Sea in the west and the Black Sea in the east. In the second decade of the 20th century, small kingdoms, independent kingdoms in the Balkans decided that time has come to uh, try to confront Ottoman Empire and finally try to liberate parts that they claimed belonged to them. Ottoman Empire was in big decline, and it was used by that was used by Balkan kingdoms to unite, and the war started in 1912. Parties of conflict were Kingdom of Serbia, Kingdom of Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Kingdom of Greece versus the Ottoman Empire. The gains that these small kingdoms uh, uh, were getting after the First World War were uh, at least at the beginning what they expected. Ottoman Empire was practically out of Europe, and its biggest city in the Balkans, besides Thessaloniki, Edirne, was also conquered by the Bulgarian and Serbian troops. However, after First World War, uh, as nothing went how some of the countries expected, that caused the start of the Second Balkan War, where the former, next slide, please, when the former allies from the First Balkan War united against Bulgaria, for who they thought gained more than they deserved. This was caused by many factors, of course, but even former enemy, which was Ottoman Empire, turned together with Serbia, Greece, and Romania against Bulgaria. So the outcome of this Second Balkan War was that Bulgaria lost almost everything that they won in the First Balkan War. Balkan Wars, however, were one of the main factors for the uh, other conflicts in the 20th century in the Balkans, especially First World War and the Second World War, and how countries of the Balkans decided which alliance will they join in the following wars. So since Serbia was the participant in both Balkan wars and in First World War, um, and the photographers that were creating these fantastic albums were sent together with the army to different parts of the Balkan Peninsula. We've chosen two sets of albums for this exhibit, even though Balkan Peninsula was always an interesting topic. So there are many other, of course, interesting albums that covered this topic. Next slide, please. So the albums that we've chosen are from the Božidar Purić papers. Božidar Purić was a very important figure of the Yugoslav diplomacy of course, royal diplomacy of the first half of the 20th century. He was serving both Serbia and Yugoslavia in several countries, including United States. And during the Second World War, he held the position of Prime Minister of the Yugoslav royal government in exile. His collection was acquired by Hoover in 1982, while the archivist was Milorad Drašković. Next slide, please. So the first album that I will talk about is the 8-volume album of Balkanski Rat of the Balkan War. Hoover holds 7 volumes out of 8. Second volume is missing, but the National Library of Serbia holds this second volume, and they had it digitized. So if anyone is interested, you could visit their website. The author is Samson Chernov, and these photos are impressive. They're very large and very in a good quality still. The format is 19 times 31 centimeters. Next slide, please. Samson Chernov was a Russian photographer who came to Serbia in 1912. He was a correspondent, and he was taking photographs for the Rusko Slovo and Novoe Vremya from St. Petersburg, and for the French Gazette L'Illustration. So he came to Serbia in 1912 to follow the Serbian army and sent reports to his newspapers and redactions. So next slide, please. He was following army wherever army went, following the army leadership, following Serbian and Montenegrin army in Macedonia, Kosovo and Metohija, Montenegro, and together with Bulgarian troops in Thrace. He was also taking photos and was very active in witnessing the medical missions and other activities. Next slide, please. And during the exhibit, since the title of this section was Witnessing Serbian 3 Wars in 5 Years, we were paying more attention on the war thematic, but I wanted to show this part of Chernov's work where he took photos of panoramas and beautiful landscapes. So especially nice were these from Edirne, Turkey, that was taken by Serbian and Bulgarian troops in the spring of 1913 after several months of siege. Next slide, please. We can see in this section of photographs beautiful panoramas. Next slide, please. Especially photographs of the beautiful Selimiye Mosque from the 16th century. Of course, he had different perspectives, and he showed to the viewers both in inner section of the mosque and the outer, and the landscape of the city. Next slide. So this is one of the photographs of Edirne as well. Next slide. Following the army, the Chernov managed to take many interesting photographs of the everyday life of soldiers that brought either time for relaxation, and next slide, and something that comes with the war. Of course, contemporaries of Samson Chernov were telling that he was trying to sometimes to make those scenes more realistic and more effective to the audience, and so for him there was a saying that he was trying to stage his photographs and hire extras in some situations. Next slide. We can see that especially in this example of Montenegro. Next slide, please. When the same person is, something is skipped. Or this traditional situations in Montenegro. Montenegrin army, just to explain, was held Skadar in Albania, or Shkodër, besieged for a couple of months, and that ended bad for Montenegro. Many soldiers died, and these photographs were made over there. By the way, Samson Chernov was active in recording videos as well. So he made a video of Skadar, the siege of Skadar. So next slide, please. So these situations from everyday life were also one of his components of his work. Next slide. Samson Chernov was also important for the historians because he provided a lot of information about the history of the weapons, fortifications, and different army segments of the military history. Next slide, please. Of course, the army equipment. Next slide. Even the first Air Force division of Balkan Wars. Next slide. The second album is the album of postcards related to the Balkan Wars in the first 3 years of the First World War in the Balkans, whose author is Risto Marjanović. Next slide. Risto Marjanović was the most famous Serbian photographer of the first half of the 20th century. By the way, he was the official photographer of the head of the Serbian army, and he also followed the head of staff during those conflicts. Next slide. His photographs are not good of quality as Samson Chernov, probably because of the equipment he was using. Samson Chernov was using more like movie camera, and Risto Marjanović different kind of camera, but he was taking photos of different movements, groups of people, especially these prisoners of war are very interesting. And the next slide, he took photos of refugees and showed the true nature of the First World War, especially during the Serbian army and civilians retreat in the fall of 1915 and the winter of 1916. Next slide, please. Next slide. And especially effective photos were with those with civilians. The main intent of Risto Marjanović photos were to send these postcards and therefore spread the propaganda or some kind of ask for help for Serbia in the first 2 years of the First World War. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for organizing today's conversation and for your introductions. And thank you also to all of my co-curators. It's been a pleasure working with everybody, and I'm thrilled to know that the exhibition will be on until June. For the purpose of today's conversation, I wanted to focus on two specific images from one album, which serve as entry points into the story of Russian emigre life in Czechoslovakia during the interwar years. First slide, please. Both images come from the Baroness Maria Vrangel archive at the Hoover Institution. The first one is the cornerstone laying of the Russian Orthodox Dormition Chapel at Olszany Cemetery in Prague on September 11, 1924, which was a spiritual and cultural symbol of the emigre community. And the second one is of Prince Petr Dimitrievich Dolgorukov in Subcarpathian Ruthenia in the summer of 1928. Together, these images illustrate the breadth of the Russian presence in Czechoslovakia, from the vibrant life in the capital to the work carried out in rural communities. Let me begin with some background on Baroness Maria Dimitrievna Vrangel and the extraordinary visual record of exile that she created. Baroness Maria Vrangel was born 1875 and lived until 1943. She was the mother of General Petr Vrangel, the final commander of the White Army, and she emerged as one of the most important chroniclers of the Russian diaspora. Following the defeat of the White Movement, she devoted herself to preserving its history and documenting the daily life and experiences of Russian emigres across Europe. Next slide, please. Beginning in the 1920s, she compiled correspondence, memoirs, printed materials, and most importantly, dozens of photograph albums. Album 17 that we see here focuses specifically on the Russian presence in Czechoslovakia and Prague and offers a remarkably comprehensive visual record of academics, clergy, military officers, artists, families, and cultural institutions. In 1933, the Hoover Institution Library Archives acquired her collection, which has since become one of the foundation sources for studying the first wave of Russian emigration. The albums are not simply documentation, they represent a deliberate effort to preserve the memory of a stateless community facing exile and cultural rupture. Through her photographs, we can trace the institutions, religious life, rural projects, publications, and personal stories that shaped Russian emigre Prague. To understand what led to the cornerstone laying of the Dormition Chapel at Olszany Cemetery, we need to mention the Russian action in Czechoslovakia. After the Civil War, the Czechoslovak government launched the Russian Action, an ambitious program that combined humanitarian relief, educational support, and professional placement for refugees. President Tomáš Masaryk and Prime Minister Karel Kramář were instrumental. Masaryk's sympathetic stance toward the Russian intelligentsia and Kramář's deep personal ties, reinforced by his Russian wife, Nadezhda Nikolaevna Kramarova, who was an active advocate for emigre assistance, ensured housing, training, and employment opportunities. This environment allowed emigre scholars, clergy, engineers, officers, and more to rebuild their professional lives, and Prague soon became a major intellectual center for the diaspora alongside Berlin and Paris, for example. It was not just a site of nostalgia, but of genuine scholarly, pedagogical, and cultural production. Some of the outcomes of the Russian action included the establishment of schools, vocational institutions, and rural training centers, the creation of the Russian Historical Archive abroad, the founding of the Russian Pedagogical Bureau, and a flourishing parish life specifically around Bishop Sergei Korolev and the Domitian Church at Olszany, which we see the cornerstone laying of here. Prague became home to a remarkable concentration of scholarly institutions, among them the Russian Free University, the Russian Pedagogical Institute, the Kondakov Institute, a major center for Byzantine studies and archaeology, the Russian Law Faculty at Charles University, technical and agricultural institutes. The city also hosted many distinguished writers and intellectuals, including Sergei Bulgakov and Vladimir Losky, who produced literary works, religious writings, and philosophical studies. White Army veterans were also represented, albeit in smaller numbers than in Serbia or France. Publishing in Prague was also prolific during that time. Notable émigré periodicals and monographs included, for example, Ruskaya Mysl, as well as various literary reviews, school textbooks, children's books, and religious and scholarly works. The Russian Historical Archive abroad's purpose was to collect, preserve, and organize the papers, publications, and institutional records of the first wave of Russian emigration. Political exiles, military organizations, cultural institutions, religious bodies, and intellectual circles displaced by the 1917 Revolution and Civil War. In June 1945, the Czechoslovak government formally transferred most of the archive's collections to the Soviet Union under pressure. However, part of it, mostly books and periodicals, was deposited with the Slavianska Knihovna, where it remained as a restricted collection until 1989. The Dormition Chapel at Olszany, featured in this exhibition in this photograph, was funded almost entirely by émigré initiative. Even artists such as Ivan Bilibin, an architect, and architect Vladimir Brandt donated some of their labor and talents. Although Masaryk's government did not fund the construction, it facilitated the land grant and legal recognition of the parish, critical steps in enabling the chapel's creation. The surrounding cemetery became the resting place of White Army officers, clergy, émigré intellectuals, and leaders of community organizations. The crypt of the chapel itself eventually became the resting place of Karen Kramorsh and Nadezhda Kramarova, whose support for the Russian action was instrumental in the flourishing of émigré life in Prague. Next slide, please. Beyond urban centers, Russian émigrés also contributed significantly to rural development. Prince Pyotr Dmitrievich Dolgorukov played a leading role in establishing agricultural schools and training centers in Subcarpathian Ruthenia. He organized cooperatives, taught agronomy and modern cultivation methods, and developed practical short-term courses aimed at economic self-sufficiency. These programs brought émigrés into close contact with Carpatho-Russian communities, supporting literacy, technical education, and religious life, while also navigating local complexities, Orthodox versus Catholic loyalties, emerging Ukrainian versus Rusin identities, and differing attitudes towards Russian cultural influence. Dolgorukov's fate mirrored that of many émigrés in 1945. He was arrested by Smersh, deported to the Soviet Union, and died in detention. The entry of the Red Army into Prague in May 1945 abruptly ended the émigré world that had flourished for 2 decades. Soviet security forces arrested former officers, officials, clergy, and anyone associated with anti-Bolshevik organizations. Many were sent to the Gulag, others were executed or died in custody. Some émigrés fled westward, others attempted to hide or obscure their identities. Returning to our two images, the cornerstone laying at Olszany and Prince Dolgorukov in the countryside, we can trace the arc of Russian emigre life in Czechoslovakia, from the creation of universities, archives, publishing houses, churches, and schools to the vibrant cultural and spiritual life that blossomed there, and finally to the abrupt collapse of this world in 1945. Through Baroness Vrangel's photographs, we can follow this history in detail, its institutions, its artistic, cultural, and scholarly achievements, and the community at large. Her albums allow us to study and better understand an important chapter of Russian history in the aftermath of revolution and war. And through these albums, we can witness the creation of a Russia abroad, as coined by Professor Mark Raev. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all of our presenters, our curators of what you have just seen is a really, truly rare and unique collection of these albums. And so with that, we're going to turn into the question and answer segment of today's event. So I'd like to direct all of our attendees today to the Q&A section on your Zoom navigation bar. If you click the Q&A, you will be able to submit a question based on all the really rich content you've heard already today. So do please submit those questions. In the meantime, as the moderator, I'll go ahead and pose some to our speakers to give you some time to consider your own. And please do, as you submit your questions, let us know where you are zooming in from today, as this Eastern Europe and beyond scope suggests. We very much have a global audience here at the Hoover Institution, and in particular our library and archives, given the over 170 countries we have represented in our collections. So we'll be keen to know where you're zooming in from, as Ognian is in fact in Rome. So please, as you submit your questions, let us know where you're at. Now that said, for the first question, and if I could please ask all of our curators and presenters to come onto Zoom so that we can see you and address you as questions come in. And again, those questions might be posed directly to one of our speakers or in general. So please do clarify in your question if it's to all of our curators or perhaps just one on one of the topics more specifically. Now for my first question, and perhaps Anatol can kick us off. You know, as co-curators, and there were many of you to put this just really profound display together, certainly you had to narrow down what was included, the final selections. We only have so much space on our walls and in our cases in the Lou Henry Hoover Gallery. So I would be interested to know, and if you could tell us more about how difficult that selection was and perhaps the thought process behind it. And if there were final selections, you know, that were obvious to you, were there tough calls to make, were there close calls, or perhaps things that were in fact omitted but still available to be researched in our reading room or online here at the library and archives?
Well, thank you. You know, choices like these are always extraordinarily difficult to make, especially when you're dealing with such an institution as the Hoover Institution with its extraordinary, rich and valuable collections. I have to say that the primary choice was not made by me, but rather by Edward Kazanitz, who is our residing specialist. Well, not really residing because he's more of a visiting fellow, but he's certainly probably the top specialist on the photographic aspects of this era and this region in the United States, if not the world. And Edward took a leading role in the creation of this exhibit. And indeed, the choice of albums and in many cases, the choice of photographs was his. And I'm not switching blame because I think he made brilliant choices. And it's an absolutely fantastic presentation. It's very difficult, as I mentioned, to make choices like these. I think he really made an effort to represent the entire region and the entire time period of the first half of the 20th century as well as could possibly be done. Now, of course, having said that, you know, I do have, you know, my own favorites. And if I could have you, please, Lauren, show that one slide again that I left specifically kind of for this purpose. So this slide, it depicts, it's one from Maria Vrangel's albums, and it depicts two scenes essentially, but the same people in each. And it's officers of the Drozdovsky Regiment, which was one of the regiments of the anti-Bolshevik armies of South Russia during the Civil War. We'll just wait for a moment for it to come on screen. But basically what you're seeing here is the same people dressed in their military uniforms, their dress uniforms, and then in their work clothes. And by work clothes, I mean, this is the reason why this photograph is so poignant to me is that after their transfer from Gallipoli and Lemnos, and I remind you that Lemnos is where the Cossacks were, and they were primarily transported to Yugoslavia, whereas the infantry on Gallipoli was transported primarily to Bulgaria to work in the mines and various, hard labor, building roads, and so on and so forth. And so this is their fate. The fate of these officers who had served in wartime beginning in 1914 all the way through 1920 in many cases. In some cases, of course, they were too young to start at the beginning of the First World War, join the army later, or joined only during the Civil War. But these are presumably, judging by their uniforms, battle-hardened veterans. And yet their fate was to become miners and laborers in Bulgaria from 1920 to approximately 1940. Some of them eventually, ultimately, after World War II, probably repatriated to the USSR, some executed, others managed to make it out and became displaced persons at the end of the Second World War, and then potentially made it to some Western countries. But basically, their lot was extraordinarily hard. And so when you look at a photograph like this and you see them in their military uniform, and you have this image of gallant officers of the Imperial Russian Army, and then you see them as they were beginning in 1921 and all the way through to the Second World War, it kind of strikes you as a painful image of the fate of people who should have been defenders of their country and honored military veterans, and instead they find themselves in a desperate situation towards the end of their lives. So this is one of the photographs that strikes me, but unfortunately you can't show everything in the exhibit. I'm going to stop there. I want to leave our time for my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatol, for those remarks and for returning to what really is a powerful image. And I'd like to also offer Ognian or Vladimir perhaps the chance to speak a bit about the selection process, if there was any kind of a deliberation that took place together with Edward and your co-curators.
Thank you for this question. And of course, the selection process overall, over the course of, I imagine, several years that was taking place through all the research that Edward Kasanek has been doing with the visual materials that the Hoover Library and Archives house. Obviously, that decision process is not an easy one. However, I was very happy to be able to work specifically on the materials that focus on the Russian emigre presence in Czechoslovakia and specifically in Prague in the interwar years. Because, as I mentioned in my remark, Prague really had been one of the scholarly, cultural, vibrant centers of the Russian diaspora in the interwar years, at least obviously in Europe, alongside Berlin and Paris, for example. However, it had a very different fate as World War II came to an end. As the Red Army arrived in Prague and occupied Prague and Czechoslovakia, became part of the Eastern Bloc, the fate of the Russian emigre community was very different than the fate of the Russian emigre community in Paris, where it continued to develop culturally and in other ways, and the same thing also in Germany. So it's really a very short period of time that we have to work with when we examine that. About 20 years in the interwar period in Prague, where we see an absolutely amazing amount of institutions, educational centers, art centers that are just flourishing. and all of a sudden, of course, coming to an end. So it's quite interesting to be able to have so much documentary evidence of that also preserved in the very rich collections of the archive of Baroness Vrangel, because one thing is, of course, just to read about it and to see it being published. The other thing is actually to be able to see the images kind of in real time as it has been chronicled by Baroness Vrangel. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, Vladimir and Anatol. And indeed, Vladimir, while we have you, could you share with the audience what milestone we've just hit as part of the Russian émigré project that you're leading in the preservation of all the wonderful newspapers?
Thank you. Thank you for this earlier plug as well for Russia Abroad Digital Collection, which is a really special and wonderful project. In fact, during my remarks, I had mentioned the Russian Historical Archive abroad, and we are actively collaborating also with institutions across the globe, including the Slavonic Library in Prague, so there's direct connection to that. But we have just actually hit a very important milestone of more than 1 million pages, in fact, about 1,100,000 pages that is now available in digitized images in digitized form on the Russia Abroad Digital Collection for anybody to research, to search, and to use. So yes, we're very happy about that. Thank you, Lauren.
And thank you for all of the work that continues with that project, in addition to all your contributions to this exhibition. We're giving you a virtual round of applause. You can't hear it, but it's very much resounding.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Indeed. And perhaps with that, I'd like to turn to Ognian, as I don't see yet any questions. Oh, indeed, we've got a question in our Q&A here. And then perhaps, Ognian, you can kick us off right where we left off.
I just wanted to mention that it was really difficult choice to make when choosing those albums, but Balkan Peninsula, especially is Hoover Institution Library and Archives, is so rich with photographic collections, especially photographic albums related to Yugoslavia. So we had several albums related to Balkan Peninsula, but these two were more connected to one topic, which was Balkan Wars. So that's why we decided to choose these, and the quality of these photographs is really exquisite. So just want to mention that, and the census that served as a base for all of our research that was created by Edward Kasanek and Higwon Yu, pardon, or maybe misspelling or mispronouncing, pardon.
Thank you, Ognian.
Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to turn to one of our questions in the chat. This comes from Ria Taylor. What types of supplementary materials, such as newspapers, historical publications, or art books, do you find most useful for providing additional context and deeper understanding when studying these historical photographic albums? Ognian, would you like to come back on to provide any thoughts? And do keep them brief, as we are about 10 minutes till our conclusion of this event.
So yeah, when it comes to these albums that I was working on, I used just the literature that were published by eminent institutions in Serbia, because it was related to that. And when it comes to newsletters, newspapers, journals, I cannot remember using them much, but bibliographic material that we can find, and especially at Hoover, like I mentioned, the census was crucial for us in preparing this exhibit.
Anatol or Vladimir, any comment on our question from Ria?
Sure, absolutely. We're fortunate to have a lot of written documents that supplement, complement, and otherwise explain and provide context to the photographs. In particular, of course, when we're talking about the images from Lemnos, for example, we've got a lot of material in the library, as well as in the archives. Of course, the primary source for that period and that event is the papers of General Vrangel himself. So we have the papers of General Vrangel, and then we have the papers of Maria Vrangel, Baroness Maria Vrangel, who was his mother, who in the emigration started to collect a lot of material about Russians in various countries and their situation, so on and so forth. So she carried on an enormous correspondence with people all around the world and collected a vast amount of material, including the photographs that went into these photographic albums to describe Russian emigres and their lives in various corners of the world. And so some of these related to the very beginnings of this emigre wave in Constantinople, today's Istanbul, in Lemnos, or rather on Lemnos and Gallipoli. And so this is covered there. Now, General Vrangel's papers also cover the period of the evacuation, how the army was distributed to Gallipoli, to Lemnos, and to some other refugee camps in Turkey and in the region. So there's a lot of background material in those two archival collections primarily, but also memoirs of individuals who were caught up in all of this. Sometimes they were junior officers, they wrote their memoirs. Some of these were published, they're in the library. There were also various bulletins, information bulletins, and camp circulars that managed to be collected and that also form a part of our library holdings. So this material is also very valuable. So the photographs, sure, they can be used as an addendum to these written sources, in other words, as illustrative material, but they're also valuable in and of themselves to analyze what people wanted the world to see them, how they wanted the world to see them. In other words, did they want the world to see them suffering, or did they want the world to see them doing gymnastics and trying to, make the best face on what was really a desperate situation? So you've got these photographs that can be analyzed on their own terms with the documentation, the paper documentation to support that, or you could do the opposite. You could use the paper documentation as your basis and use the photographs as illustrative material. So it can go either way. But we do have fantastic resources. A little bit less on the Czechs in Czechoslovaks in Siberia, primarily because most of those materials would be in archives in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But nevertheless, we do have some material on that as well in the archives and in the library. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatol. And Vladimir, if I may, we do have a question from one of our participants. So allow me to ask this one, and do include any of your thoughts from Ria's, perhaps with your response to Robert Olesh, who is zooming in from Omaha, Nebraska. I like the Midwestern representation. If the curators could please, in these remaining 5 or so minutes, share any big surprises that you found in the albums, any aha moments, or great finds. Again, a question from Robert. Over to you all. Perhaps starting with Vladimir.
Thank you. I did want to also add to a thought to what my colleagues already answered regarding Ria's question. And even though there's not much that one can add, but very often when it comes to exhibitions, be it in museums or galleries, one might see that either three-dimensional objects are presented, or you have visual materials, or you may have documents, depending also on what kind of exhibition it is. Is it history? Is it art? Is it photographica? And really, it's always important, and I think that this is in this particular project, this exhibition is really very well done. The way that the entire checklist was created for the exhibition is to this kind of holistic approach where you have all of the 3 different kinds of items that might be telling the story and presenting the best kind of narrative, where you have the 3-dimensional objects of the albums together with the visual materials, the photographs and documents presented to create this kind of story. And in terms of working with these albums, I'm going to keep it short to allow my colleagues to continue, but I think one of the most surprising things for me was looking through that specific album Number 17, not only did I find a photograph of my grandparents there, but even a photograph of my father and my uncle as they were little boys right in the center of Prague. So with that, I will pass it on.
Well, I can only add that I'm fortunate to be able every day to make a discovery or to rediscover something that I'd forgotten about at the Hoover Institution. So it's really a dream job for me, and I'm extraordinarily grateful in this post-Thanksgiving these post-Thanksgiving days to give thanks to Herbert Hoover, to my colleagues, and to everyone who is involved in this particular project for allowing me to once again see some of these objects anew and rediscover them, and to discover some new ones along the way. So every day is a discovery at the Hoover Institution. I love this place and this job.
I will completely agree with Anatol, and but if I have to choose, I would definitely choose the photo that we've already chosen, and that's the photo with the falcon and the soldiers. And I think it's available on the online exhibition. And the other one that was kind of surprise was the Ottoman Turkish prisoners of war with added crosses in their faces as a symbol of some kind of revenge, and like that being sent to Turkey. So that was kind of a surprise. Thanks.
Thank you to all those who submit questions today, and of course to all of our curators here with us, Anatol, Ognian, and Vladimir. We are so grateful for your expertise, your willingness to share it, and your continued commitment to the library and archives and the important work taking place. I don't think Anatol could have given us a better testimonial for just how exciting it is to work here, whether you are a history buff or just discovering the joys of archival research. So with that, I'll go ahead and close out today's event with just a few brief announcements and also thanks. Now, we have over 6,000 collections here at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. There are 25 albums and several collections featured in Eastern Europe and beyond, Photographic Albums Revealed. But in addition to what you can find in the Hoover Tower, now until June of 2026, I'm very happy to announce it will be extended beyond the original date of closure in February. You can also browse through a 522-page research guide and census that was completed by one of our primary curators, who you've heard the name of mentioned today, Edward Kasanek. And I believe he's joined us today online. And so as he won't be able to zoom in and speak, I would just like to really thank Edward Kasanek, who is our visiting fellow, for all of the work that he's done to bring this to life. His ingenuity, his tenacity, his love of history is visceral, and I think it really comes across in the galleries through the research guide and also now on the online exhibition put together by Marissa Ree. So please know that all of these resources are available to you. The galleries are free to explore. So when you do join us here on campus, we'll very much look forward to welcoming you. This recording and this event will be available online, so do give us a bit of time to produce and upload the recording for all to watch and share. And with that, I would like to close this event with a quote from our gallery talk by Archivist Emerita Elena Danielson, who I believe has also joined us online today. Thank you, Elena. And what she concluded her gallery talk with was that Europe is indeed a state of mind. Eastern Europe in particular is a state of mind more than anything, and that the people represented in these albums, the geographies represented in these albums, want you to notice their experience. And as Anatol mentioned, that experience is all-encompassing across conflict, across life, joy and devastation and tragedy, as well as triumph. So thank you all for being engaged in this work, and we very much look forward to welcoming you at the next Hoover Institution Library and Archives event. A very happy holidays, and see you soon.